The council chamber was silent when Chairman Gregory Wells raised his hand to speak. Kate Morrison stood alone in the center of the massive room, while holographic images of 73 alien species watched her from their distant worlds. She wore her blue Earth uniform with pride even though she knew what was coming. The faces staring at her showed fear and anger and something worse than both of those things combined. They showed disgust. Gregory Wells was an old alien with gray skin and 4 arms who had led the Galactic Council for 30 years. His voice echoed through the chamber when he finally spoke. He told Kate that humanity had been found guilty of breaking the preservation accords and starting wars without permission and ruining the trade routes that connected the galaxy. He asked her how humanity would plead to these charges. Kate lifted her head and looked straight at the chairman without showing any fear. She told him that humans had only defended themselves against pirates. The Vexithari had attacked human merchant ships again and again. Earth had asked the Council to help them 6 different times. The Council had done nothing to stop the attacks. A reptilian creature from the Scaran Collective made a hissing sound of disapproval. The alien said that humans had destroyed 3 entire Vexithari colony worlds. That was not defense, according to the alien. That was genocide. Kate responded quickly and firmly. She explained that those colonies had contained military bases and weapon factories. Humanity had warned all civilians to evacuate before the attacks. Very few civilians had died in the strikes. Everything had been done according to the rules of war. Chairman Wells slammed his hand on the table hard enough to make the sound carry across all the speakers. He said that the Council had made its final decision. Humanity had proven that it could not exist peacefully with other civilized species. Humans were too aggressive and too violent and too dangerous to be part of galactic society. Therefore, all human worlds would be placed under immediate quarantine. No alien species could enter the solar system anymore. No human could leave Earth or any of its colonies. Humanity was being exiled from the stars. Kate felt her blood run cold in her veins. She could not believe what she was hearing. She asked if the Council was really going to condemn 4 billion human beings to complete isolation from the rest of the galaxy. Chairman Wells said that the decision was final and could not be changed. The quarantine would begin in exactly 72 hours. All human vessels had to return to Earth immediately. Every trade agreement was now void and cancelled. Humanity had been judged by the Council and found to be unworthy of joining the galactic community. Jake Harrison was the captain of a merchant ship called Unity's Dawn. He stood on his bridge watching the stars blur past as his ship jumped through hyperspace heading back toward Earth. Behind his vessel, the human colony of New Seattle was getting smaller and smaller until it disappeared completely. His crew of 43 people worked in total silence as they listened to the Council's message being broadcast on every frequency. The message kept repeating over and over. All human settlements outside the solar system had to be evacuated right away. The quarantine was absolute and would be enforced with deadly force. Any ship that tried to break the quarantine would be destroyed immediately without warning. Amy Cross was Jake's first officer and his most trusted friend. She walked up to him carrying a datapad full of reports from across human space. She told Jake that the Council was very serious about enforcing the exile. 3 ships that had refused to turn around had already been destroyed by Galactic Defense Force patrol vessels. The pilots and crews were all dead. Jake made tight fists with both hands. He asked Amy how many people humanity was being forced to leave behind in the evacuations. Amy looked at her datapad and read the numbers out loud. There were 12 colony worlds and 17 orbital stations, and countless frontier settlements scattered across dozens of star systems, maybe 200,000 people in total. Some colonists were trying to get on evacuation ships, but most of them would not make it back to Earth before the deadline ended. Jake asked what the Council expected those people to do. Just die alone out there in space. Amy shook her head slowly. She said the Council did not care at all about human lives. To the aliens, humanity was nothing but a bunch of violent savages who did not deserve to have a place among the civilized species of the galaxy. Jake stared out at the viewport, watching the last traces of humanity's presence beyond Earth fade away into the darkness of space. He told Amy that they would show the Council what happened when you cornered savages and gave them no choice. He ordered her to set a course for Earth at maximum possible speed. Humanity had a lot of work to do. The journey back to Earth took 3 weeks. During that time, Jake and his crew listened to more and more terrible news. Human colonies that could not evacuate in time were being cut off forever. Families were being separated. Children were crying for parents they would never see again. The Council had placed massive defense platforms around the solar system to enforce the quarantine. Any ship that tried to cross the boundary was fired upon without mercy. When Unity's Dawn finally reached Earth orbit, Jake could see thousands of other ships doing the same thing. The sky above the planet was crowded with returning vessels. Some were military warships, others were merchant ships like his. Many were small personal craft carrying refugees who had barely escaped with their lives. Jake received a message from Earth Command telling him to land at the Geneva spaceport. When his ship touched down, he and Amy were immediately taken to a meeting with government officials. The room was full of angry people demanding to know what humanity was going to do about this injustice. The president of Earth's unified government was a woman named Helen Carter. She stood at the front of the room and raised her hands for silence. When everyone finally stopped shouting, she spoke in a calm, clear voice. She said that humanity had been betrayed by the Council. The aliens had abandoned Earth in its time of need, but humans would not give up. They would not accept exile quietly. Instead, they would use this time to grow stronger. President Carter explained her plan. Earth would focus all of its resources on research and development. They would build new ships with better engines. They would create more powerful weapons. They would develop technology that the Council had never dreamed of. And when the time was right, humanity would return to the stars, not as beggars asking for permission, but as conquerors who took what they deserved. The crowd cheered at her words. Jake felt something stirring in his chest. It was hope mixed with determination mixed with rage. The Council thought they had ended humanity's dream of exploring the galaxy. Instead, they had given humanity something far more dangerous. They had given humans a reason to become the most powerful force the universe had ever seen. 50 years had passed since the exile began. Dr. Lisa Chen floated in zero gravity inside the research station called Prometheus while she studied the data from her latest experiment. All around her, holographic displays showed complex mathematical equations and energy readings that would have seemed impossible when the quarantine first started. The numbers were beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Lisa spoke to her team through the communication system. She told them that the quantum drive was finally stable. The energy efficiency had reached 97%. A ship using this new engine could travel from Earth to Alpha Centauri in just 3 hours, instead of the 6 weeks it used to take. This was technology that broke every rule the Council had claimed was impossible to break. Marcus Liu was an engineer who had worked with Lisa for 20 years. He floated over to her station with a big smile on his face. He said that the Council would lose their minds if they knew what humanity had achieved. The fastest Council ship still took 4 weeks to make the same journey that human ships could now complete in hours. Lisa nodded, but her expression was grim. She pointed out that they were assuming the Council still existed at all. Humanity had not heard anything from beyond the quarantine barrier in 20 years. For all anyone knew, the entire Galactic Council could be dead and gone. The quarantine had changed humanity in ways that no one could have predicted. Being cut off from galactic trade and alien technology had forced Earth to innovate or die. The first 10 years after the exile had been absolutely brutal. There were resource shortages everywhere. The economy collapsed. Cities burned in riots as people fought over food and water and fuel. Governments fell apart. Millions died, but humanity had adapted the way it always did. Humans were survivors. They learned to do more with less. They developed fusion power plants that made the Council's antimatter reactors look like primitive campfires. They created artificial intelligence systems that could coordinate the defense networks of entire planets. They built weapons capable of cracking moons in half. And they built ships by the thousands with each new design more advanced than the last. Marcus interrupted Lisa's thoughts by telling her that the president wanted to see her immediately. It was something urgent about the deep space monitoring network that humanity had secretly deployed beyond the quarantine zone. President Daniel Foster stood in the war room buried deep beneath the city of Geneva. The room was filled with military officers and scientists all staring at a holographic display that showed a signal detected 3 days earlier by long-range sensors. The signal had come from somewhere far beyond the quarantine barrier in what used to be Council space. President Foster ordered his staff to play the signal again. Static crackled through the speakers at first, but gradually the noise resolved into words spoken in Galactic Standard language. It was a language that most young humans had never even heard before. The voice belonged to Chairman Gregory Wells. He sounded old and weak and absolutely desperate. He said that the Galactic Council was under attack by an unknown enemy. These attackers had appeared 15 years ago from somewhere beyond the edge of the galaxy. The Council had already lost 2/3 of its territory to these invaders. The Skarn Collective was completely gone. The Vexthari had been driven to extinction. The Council was running out of options and running out of time. Wells begged anyone who could hear the message to help them. Any species with military capability needed to respond. "Please help us," he said. "Please." Complete silence filled the war room when the message ended. President Foster leaned back in his chair and thought about what this meant. The mighty Galactic Council that had condemned humanity as too violent for civilization was now begging for help from the very species they had exiled. Foster asked his staff how long ago the message had been sent. Admiral Helen Park checked the signal analysis data and reported that the transmission had originated approximately 6 months earlier. Given the vast distances involved, the actual situation out there could be much worse by now. President Foster stood up and walked over to the window overlooking the rebuilt city. He asked his advisors for their opinions on what humanity should do. General Nathan Wright was the first to speak. He said that humanity definitely had the capability to respond to the distress call. The fleet was ready for combat. They had been preparing for this exact moment for 50 years. Every ship and every weapon and every soldier was trained and equipped to fight. But another voice spoke up from across the room. This advisor reminded everyone that the Council had exiled humanity. They had left Earth to die alone. Why should humans help the very people who had abandoned them? President Foster turned back to face his advisors. He said that humanity would help because they were better than the Council had ever been. Humans did not abandon people even when those people were enemies. But there was another reason that was even more important. Whatever force had destroyed 2/3 of the galaxy could eventually find its way to Earth. Humanity needed to know what they were dealing with before the threat arrived at their doorstep. Under straightened his shoulders and made his decision. He ordered all fleets to be recalled immediately. Humanity was going back to the stars after 50 years of forced isolation. The mobilization happened faster than anyone expected. Within 2 weeks, every military vessel in the solar system had assembled near Mars. There were 300 warships in total, representing the cutting edge of human technology. Each ship bristled with weapons that could destroy asteroids. Their shields could withstand the heat of a star. Their engines could cross light years in hours. Commander Ryan Mitchell stood on the bridge of the warship Defiance looking at the tactical display. His ship was the newest and most powerful vessel in the fleet. Around him, his crew worked with calm efficiency as they prepared to cross the quarantine boundary for the first time in half a century. The tactical officer reported that all systems were green. Weapons were fully charged. Shields were at maximum strength. The entire fleet was in perfect formation and ready to move on Ryan's command. Ryan studied the fleet composition on his display. 300 ships might not sound like many, but each one carried more firepower than entire Council battle groups used to have. These vessels represented humanity's answer to exile. Not surrender, but transformation into something stronger than before. The sensor operator called out a warning. The automated defense platforms that the Council had placed around the solar system were still active and operational. They had detected the human fleet and were now targeting every ship with weapons that had once seemed unstoppable. Ryan smiled calmly. He told his crew that those platforms had been built using Council technology from 50 years ago. Human shields would hold against them easily. He gave the order to take the fleet through the barrier. The Defiant surged forward, leading 300 ships toward the invisible quarantine boundary. The moment they crossed the line, the ancient weapon platforms activated and fired their energy beams. Bright lances of destructive power that could have vaporized old Earth ships struck the Defiance's shields and simply splashed away. Harmlessly like water hitting a rock, Ren ordered his weapons officer to return fire. He wanted precision strikes only. The platform should be disabled, not destroyed, because they might have historical value for study later. The Defiance's weapons fired using principles that the Council had never discovered. Within minutes, every automated defense platform was reduced to drifting scrap metal. The navigation officer announced that they were through the barrier. She set a course for the last known location of the Galactic Council. Ryan activated the fleet-wide communication system. He told all ships that they were entering unknown territory. The galaxy had changed dramatically during 50 years of isolation. Everyone needed to stay alert and maintain formation. He reminded them that they were not here for revenge. They were here to save whatever remained of galactic civilization. The human fleet emerged from quantum space near what used to be the Council's central hub. The massive space station had once been called Unity Prime and served as the heart of galactic civilization. Now it was nothing but ruins drifting in the darkness of space. Someone on the bridge of the Defiance whispered in horror at the sight. The station's vast rings were broken into pieces. Debris fields stretched for thousands of kilometers in every direction. Scattered among the wreckage were the destroyed hulls of Council warships. Their advanced technology had been torn apart by weapons that left strange crystalline scars on the metal. Commander Ryan Mitchell ordered his sensor operators to scan for survivors. The sensors detected faint power signatures coming from Section 7 of the main ring. But the sensors also picked up something else. Unknown energy readings were coming from approximately 50,000 kilometers away from the ruins. Ryan asked if those readings belonged to the enemy. The sensor operator said they could not tell for certain, but whatever was out there was moving toward the station ruins. They would reach any survivors before the human fleet could get there. Ryan made his decision instantly. He ordered all ships to go to battle stations. Rescue shuttles would launch immediately to evacuate the survivors. The main fleet would intercept the unknown contacts. It was time to see what had scared the Galactic Council so badly. The human ships accelerated forward. Their quantum drives left trails of distorted space as they moved to intercept the approaching enemy. As they closed the distance, the sensors began to resolve more details about the hostile vessels. The enemy ships were unlike anything in humanity's entire database. They looked like massive crystalline structures that seemed to have grown organically instead of being built in shipyards. An eerie bioluminescent glow pulsed through their hulls. They moved with fluid grace like living creatures swimming through water. Their formations adapted and changed in response to the human fleet's approach. The tactical officer reported that the enemy was scanning the human ships. They were analyzing human weapons and defenses and technology, learning everything they could. Ryan told his crew to let the enemy look all they wanted. They were about to learn that humanity did not scare easily. He gave the order for all ships to arm weapons and engage at will. The crystalline ships opened fire first. They unleashed beams of energy that had previously shattered Council vessels like glass. Those same beams struck the Defiance's shields and simply stopped. The energy dissipated harmlessly into the quantum field generators that humanity had developed during the long years of exile. Ryan watched the tactical display with grim satisfaction. He ordered his weapons officer to return fire and test the enemy defenses. The human fleet unleashed a coordinated strike. Railguns fired projectiles at speeds approaching the speed of light. Plasma cannons hot enough to melt asteroids carved through space. Most devastating of all were the quantum disruptors that could tear apart molecular bonds at the subatomic level. The crystalline ship's shields flickered under the assault and then failed completely. The first enemy vessel shattered into 1,000 pieces. Its fragments spun off into the darkness of space. The other hostile ships immediately began adapting. Their formations shifted, their shields reconfigured to handle the new threat. But they were too slow. Humanity had spent 50 years preparing for war. Within 20 minutes, the entire enemy formation had been destroyed. The human fleet had suffered 0 casualties. Not a single ship had even taken damage to its shields. Ryan ordered his salvage teams to secure the wreckage. He wanted to know everything possible about these enemies. Scientists needed to study their technology and biology. Meanwhile, the rescue shuttles were already on their way to evacuate the survivors from Unity Prime. The rescue team found 37 survivors huddled inside a sealed section of the ruined station. They were representatives from various council species. They looked half-starved and terrified. When they saw human soldiers approaching in advanced combat armor with weapons ready, several of the aliens cringed back in fear. Others just stared in complete disbelief. Chairman Gregory Wells was among the survivors. He looked ancient now. His gray skin was wrinkled and his forearms trembled with weakness. When he recognized the humans, his eyes went wide. He whispered that they had actually come. After everything the Council had done to humanity, the humans had still come back to help. Captain Laura Bennett was leading the rescue team. She nodded curtly at the old chairman. She told him that humanity had picked up his distress signal. Now they needed to get all the survivors to the medical bay immediately. As they moved through the ruined corridors of the station, Chairman Wells grabbed Laura's arm. He asked her how this was possible. How did humanity have such advanced technology? Human weapons and ships were centuries beyond anything the Council had possessed at its height. Laura looked at him with cold eyes. She reminded him that he had exiled humanity. The Council had cut Earth off from the entire galaxy. Wells had thought he was punishing humans, but instead he had given them something far more valuable. He had given them motivation. Humanity had spent 50 years building an arsenal because they knew that eventually they would need to defend themselves against a hostile universe. Chairman Wells spoke urgently. He told Laura that the enemy was called the Harvesters. They had appeared 15 years ago from beyond the galactic rim. The Harvesters consumed everything in their path. They converted matter into more copies of themselves. They had already destroyed hundreds of worlds. Nothing the Council tried had been able to stop them. Laura replied that humanity had just destroyed a dozen Harvester ships in 20 minutes. She thought humans could probably manage to handle the rest of them too. Wells shook his head desperately. He said that Laura did not understand the true scope of the threat. What they had fought was just a small scouting force. The main Harvester fleet numbered in the millions of ships. They had hive vessels the size of small moons, and the Harvesters adapted to every strategy. Every tactic the Council used, the enemy learned from and developed counters against. Laura paused and considered this new information carefully. She told Wells that humanity would just have to be creative then. Fortunately for the Council, being creative was something humans excelled at. Back on the Defiance, Commander Ryan Mitchell reviewed the data his scientists had collected from the destroyed Harvester vessels. The technology was completely alien. It combined organic and mechanical elements in ways that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The crystalline structure could repair itself. It could adapt to new threats. It was designed to consume and convert any matter it encountered. But there were weaknesses. The Harvesters relied on a networked intelligence. They shared information across their entire fleet instantaneously. That meant they learned fast, but it also meant they were predictable. If humanity could disrupt that network, the enemy would lose their greatest advantage. Ryan called a conference with his senior officers. He told them that they were facing an enemy that had destroyed most of the galaxy. The Harvesters outnumbered humanity by millions to one. They had technology that could adapt to any conventional weapon, but they had never faced humans before. The tactical officer asked what their strategy should be. Ryan smiled grimly. He said that humanity would do what it always did best. They would find the enemy's weakness and exploit it ruthlessly. They would use unconventional tactics that the Harvesters could not predict. They would hit hard and fast and disappear before the enemy could adapt. And most importantly, they would never fight fair. Ryan activated the fleet communications. He told all ship commanders that they were at war. The enemy had nearly destroyed galactic civilization. Now humanity would show these Harvesters what happened when they threatened Earth and its allies. The long exile was over. Humanity had returned to the stars, and they were not leaving ever again. The war against the Harvesters lasted 3 brutal years. It was unlike anything humanity had ever experienced before. The enemy adapted to every tactic the humans used. They learned from every defeat. They studied every victory. But humanity adapted faster. General Nathan Wright stood in the command center aboard the massive flagship called Indomitable. The ship had been commissioned specifically for this war. Around him, holographic displays showed the strategic situation across dozens of star systems. Human fleets had successfully retaken 40% of the territory lost to the Harvesters in the past year alone. The intelligence officer reported new data. The main Harvester hive fleet was gathering near the Andromeda approach vector. Intelligence estimated their strength at approximately 4 million vessels. It was their largest concentration of forces since the war began. Nathan asked how many ships humanity could commit to the battle. The logistics officer checked her calculations and reported that they could deploy a maximum of 50,000 vessels. That would give the Harvesters a numerical advantage of 80 to 1. Nathan smiled grimly at those odds. He told his staff that they would not fight the enemy head-on in a direct engagement. Instead, they would deploy the Nova mines across the Harvester fleet's projected path. Human fleets would use hit-and-run formations to keep the enemy off balance. And most importantly, they would activate Project Prometheus. The science officer spoke up nervously. She reminded the general that Project Prometheus was still in the experimental phase. The quantum cascade reaction could potentially be unstable. There was a risk that it might not work as designed. Nathan replied that it was time to test the weapon in actual combat conditions. If humanity was going to save the galaxy, they needed to make a decisive statement. No more running away from the enemy. No more purely defensive actions. They would end this war today. The preparations took 2 weeks. Human ships moved into position along multiple vectors surrounding the Harvester gathering point. Thousands of Nova mines were deployed in carefully calculated patterns. Each mine contained enough antimatter to vaporize a planet. Engineers worked around the clock installing the Prometheus device on a specially modified carrier vessel. Commander Ryan Mitchell was given command of the overall fleet operation. He studied the tactical projections, endlessly looking for any flaw in the plan. The margin for error was razor-thin. If the Harvesters detected the trap too early, they would scatter. If the quantum cascade failed to activate properly, millions of human lives would be lost. The day of the battle arrived. The Harvester fleet began its approach exactly as intelligence had predicted. 4 million crystalline vessels moving in perfect coordination. Their bioluminescent glow created an eerie spectacle that could be seen across dozens of light years. Ryan gave the order to begin the operation. Human ships appeared from quantum space at seemingly random points around the Harvester formation. They fired volleys of missiles and energy weapons and then disappeared before the enemy could respond effectively. The Harvesters adapted their formation, trying to counter the hit-and-run attacks. Exactly as planned, they compressed their fleet into a tighter defensive configuration. When the enemy fleet reached critical density, Ryan activated the Nova mines. Thousands of antimatter explosions erupted simultaneously throughout the Harvester formation. Millions of ships were destroyed in the opening seconds. The surviving vessels tried to scatter, but they were too tightly packed together. They crashed into each other, creating more chaos and destruction. Then Ryan gave the final command. Activate Project Prometheus. The carrier vessel jumped to the exact center of the Harvester fleet and released its payload, a quantum cascade device that had taken 3 years to develop. The device activated and began to generate a specific frequency of energy that resonated with the crystalline structure of Harvester vessels. The effect was immediate and devastating. The crystalline hulls of the enemy ships began to vibrate. The vibrations increased rapidly, becoming more and more violent. Within minutes, the vibrations reached a critical threshold. 4 million Harvester vessels shattered simultaneously like glass hitting a resonance frequency. Their fragments created a debris field so vast it would take centuries to clear. The Battle of Andromeda approach lasted exactly 3 hours from start to finish. When it was over, the main Harvester threat had been completely eliminated. The human fleet had lost less than 200 ships. It was the most decisive victory in the history of warfare. News of the victory spread across what remained of galactic civilization like wildfire. The species that had survived the Harvester invasion could barely believe what had happened. Humanity had accomplished in 3 years what the Council had failed to do in 15. They had broken the enemy that seemed unbeatable. Over the next 6 months, human fleets hunted down the remaining fragments of Harvester forces. Small groups of enemy vessels still operated in remote sectors, but they were disorganized and leaderless. Without their main hive fleet to coordinate them, they were easily destroyed. The war was over. The Harvesters were extinct, and humanity stood as the undisputed military power of the galaxy. President Daniel Foster stood before a gathering of representatives from 70 different species. They met in a simple conference room in Geneva, rather than some grand ceremonial chamber. The old Galactic Council chamber on Unity Prime was still being rebuilt. These representatives were all that remained of their civilizations. Most of their worlds were still recovering from the devastation of the war. Chairman Gregory Wells spoke first. His voice was filled with emotion as he addressed President Foster. He said that humanity had saved them all. Against impossible odds, and after being condemned by the very people they rescued, the humans had come back and saved galactic civilization. The entire galaxy owed humanity a debt that could never be repaid. Foster nodded slowly. He told the assembled representatives that what they owed humanity was understanding. The Council had exiled Earth because they thought humans were too violent and too dangerous. They had been right about the dangerous part. But they had not understood that sometimes the galaxy needed dangerous people. Sometimes violence was the only answer to violence. Foster gestured to a holographic display showing the restored sectors of space. He pointed out that the old council was gone. Most civilizations were rebuilding from nothing. They needed leadership and protection and coordination. Humanity could provide all of those things. A murmur ran through the assembled representatives. Chairman Wells leaned forward. He asked if Foster was proposing that humanity take control of the entire galaxy. Foster corrected him immediately. Not control, he said. Stewardship. Humanity had the military strength and the technology and the organizational capability. They could protect the trade routes. They could arbitrate disputes between species. They could defend against any external threats that might appear. But humans would not rule through fear or oppression. They would create what the Council should have created from the beginning. A true union of equals where every species had a voice that mattered. Foster paused and his expression became very serious. He told them to make no mistake about one thing. Any species that threatened galactic peace would face humanity's full military response. Earth had learned from the Council's mistakes. The new order would be built on unity through strength and peace, through vigilance and prosperity through cooperation. The vote was unanimous. Every species present agreed to accept human leadership. They had no real choice. Humanity controlled the most powerful military force in the galaxy. But more than that, they had proven themselves worthy of the responsibility. They had saved everyone when no one else could. The age of the Galactic Council was over. The age of the human protectorate had begun. 20 years had passed since the end of the war. Admiral Ryan Mitchell stood on the observation deck of the new Unity station, looking out at the rebuilt hub of galactic civilization. The station stretched out below him in gleaming rings that were vastly larger than anything the old council had ever constructed. Ships from 100 different species moved through the traffic lanes in perfect coordination. His daughter Jennifer. Mitchell was now a lieutenant serving in the Galactic Defense Fleet. She joined him at the viewport and looked out at the impressive sight. She said it was hard to believe that this had all been ruins just 20 years ago. Ryan nodded in agreement. He told Jennifer that her grandfather would have been proud to see this. President? Foster had lived long enough to see humanity transform from exiled outcasts to the essential foundation of galactic civilization. Jennifer gestured toward the diverse crowd visible through the observation windows. Representatives from dozens of species worked together in the station. She asked her father if he ever wondered whether the old council had been right. Maybe humans really were too violent and too dangerous for civilized society. Ryan admitted that he thought about that question every single day. But then he remembered what happened when the council tried to build peace through weakness and philosophical ideals. The harvesters had nearly destroyed everything, because the council could not defend what they had built. Humans were not too violent, he said. They were exactly violent enough. He turned to face his daughter directly. The galaxy needed guardians, not philosophers, he explained. The council had tried their way and it had failed catastrophically. Now all these species lived under human protection, and for the first time in recorded history there was actual lasting peace. Not because everyone loved each other, but because everyone understood that breaking the peace meant facing humanity's fleet. Jennifer smiled at her father's explanation. She asked if that meant humans were basically the galaxy's watchdogs. Ryan corrected her gently. Shepherds would be a better word, he said. And the wolves of the universe had learned a very long time ago not to hunt anywhere near the human flock. Beyond the viewport, thousands of ships continued their peaceful activities. Merchant vessels carried goods between star systems. Passenger liners transported tourists and diplomats. Scientific research ships explored unknown regions of space. And watching over all of it were the distinctive silhouettes of human warships, silent and vigilant guardians keeping the peace. The human empire had not been built through conquest in the traditional sense. It had been built through necessity, when the harvesters threatened to consume everything humanity had stepped forward. When chaos threatened to tear apart what remained of civilization, humanity had provided order. When species needed protection, humanity had offered its fleet. Admiral Mitchell walked with his daughter through the station corridors. They passed representatives from species that had once been enemies. The Vexithari who had raided human ships were now peaceful traders. The Skarn who had called for humanity's exile were now loyal allies. Even Chairman Wells in his final years before death had admitted that the Council had been wrong about humans. They reached the memorial hall where names of those who had died in the war were inscribed on crystalline walls, thousands upon thousands of names from dozens of species, humans and aliens who had fought side by side against the Harvesters. The memorial reminded everyone why the Protectorate existed. Jennifer asked her father what would happen if humanity ever became like the old Council. What if humans started to think they were superior to everyone else? What if they forgot why they were given this responsibility? Ryan placed his hand on his daughter's shoulder. He told her that was why people like her were so important. Every generation of humans needed to remember the exile. They needed to remember what it felt like to be abandoned and alone. They needed to remember that their power came with responsibility. The moment humanity forgot those lessons, they would become exactly what the Council had feared. That evening, Ryan attended a council session in the main chamber. Representatives from every member species gathered to discuss various issues. Trade disputes between the Fenari and the Koloss, scientific cooperation on a new quantum drive project, defense budget allocations for frontier systems. The human representative was a diplomat named Victor Stone. He listened carefully to every speaker. He asked questions. He offered suggestions. But he did not dictate policy. The Protectorate had been designed to give every species a genuine voice in galactic affairs. Humanity provided security and coordination, but not tyranny. When votes were taken on various proposals, humans had the same single vote as any other species. The difference was that humanity controlled the military. That meant human opinions carried weight even when humans were not trying to intimidate anyone. It was a delicate balance of power. After the session ended, Ryan met with Victor Stone privately. He asked the diplomat how things were really going. Victor admitted that some species still resented human dominance. They felt like they had simply traded one overlord for another. But most species understood the alternative. Without human protection, the galaxy would descend into chaos or fall to the next major threat that appeared. Ryan understood the concern. He told Victor that humanity needed to prove itself worthy of trust every single day. They could never take their position for granted. The moment they did, they would lose the moral authority that made the Protectorate work. On Earth, President Sarah Cole addressed a crowd gathered in the rebuilt city of Geneva. She spoke about the 70 years since the exile began. She talked about the hardships humanity had endured. She reminded everyone of the sacrifices made during the war against the Harvesters, and she challenged the next generation to do better. President Cole said that humanity had been given a second chance. The exile could have destroyed Earth. Instead, it had forged humans into something stronger. But strength alone was not enough. Humanity needed wisdom and compassion and humility. They needed to remember that power was a tool, not a right. The crowd cheered her words. Young people who had never known the exile listened carefully. They were the future of the Protectorate. They would inherit the responsibility of keeping the galaxy safe and peaceful. Back on Unity Station, Admiral Mitchell stood once more at the observation deck. He thought about everything that had happened. The exile that was meant to punish humanity had instead created the most powerful empire the galaxy had ever seen. But it was an empire built on protection, not conquest. An empire built on cooperation, not subjugation. Jennifer joined him again. She had been thinking about their earlier conversation. She asked her father what he thought would happen in another 50 years or 100 years. Would humanity still be the guardians of peace, or would something change? Ryan smiled at his daughter. He said that the future was always uncertain. Maybe someday another species would rise to share the burden of protection. Maybe humanity would eventually step back and let others lead. Or maybe humans would need to defend the galaxy against new threats that had not appeared yet. The only certainty was that humanity would never abandon their responsibility. They had learned that lesson too well during the exile. The observation deck grew quiet as father and daughter watched the endless stream of ships moving through space. Somewhere out there beyond the known galaxy, new challenges waited. New enemies might emerge. New crises would test the Protectorate. But humanity would face them all. Banished and forgotten by the Galactic Council 70 years ago, humanity had returned from exile stronger than anyone imagined possible. They had saved galactic civilization from extinction. They had built an empire not through conquest but through necessity, and now they ruled not because they wanted power, but because no one else could do what needed to be done. The galaxy had tried to exile humanity, thinking they were too dangerous for civilization. Instead, they had created the very force they feared. But it was a force tempered by hardship and guided by responsibility. A force that understood that true strength meant protecting the weak, not exploiting them. And so humanity stood watch over the stars. Silent guardians keeping the peace, ready to face whatever challenges came next. The empire built by the banished and forgotten now ruled the galaxy, not through fear but through the simple understanding that someone had to do the hard work of keeping everyone safe, and humans had proven time and again that they were willing to pay that price.